Professor Leland G. Barsdley liked it in Ipham Cove. It was so full of character. During the summer, the tourists would come flocking, and they were always such an interesting pack. During the winter, you just had the locals, who were a colorful bunch in and of themselves. Professor Barsdley always found people so fascinating. After all, why else would he have gotten into anthropology? He had lived here ever since he had been hired for a teaching position at the local college. It was much easier than commuting, especially since the Pretty Boy College was close enough to his house that he could get there with time and to spare. He often liked to take a stroll through the town before class, to admire the scenery, and usually to stop by the Starlight Tea House for a refreshing cup of tea. It was a popular spot, where quite the crowd would gather in the morning. Today, though, it seemed quite the crowd was gathering at the cake shop next door. Apparently, some unfortunate young woman had been murdered. By the Mafia, if he had to guess. There had already been rumors of Mafias coming to their tiny town, but they never had murdered anyone before. Professor Barsdley, however, was not terribly surprised by this sudden twist. After all, if there really were Mafias in their town, it was really only a matter of time before it came to this. "Come now, everyone, try to remain calm," he spoke up, managing to stay collected through the chaos. "It won't do us any good to crowd around the poor woman's body. Clearly this incident needs to be properly investigated." Professor Barsdley was beginning to think that no one had heard him, especially considering that things only seemed to get crazier after he suggested calming down. It turned out at least one person had heard him, however, as a young woman with bright blue pigtails approached him on the matter. She looked a little familiar. She might have been an accountant. "Excuse me," she chirped, glancing up at him. "I agree with you, mister. We need to find out who did this, and why. We should get together an investigation party promptly. It's terrible what happened to Miss Twef, but we are helpless to save her now. We need to know how to prevent something like this from happening again. There's an approximately 30% chance the murderer will strike again. We need to stop it. You, me, and whoever joins us. No one should die alone in the snow." "An investigation party? Yes, that may be for the best," he agreed, pulling up the sleeve of his thick overcoat a bit to look at his watch. Normally he would be starting class at around this time, but this early in the month, school is still out for winter break. That said, it was a habit of his to keep an eye on the clock. "We should see if anyone else is interested, then spread out and search for evidence. If we hurry, we may be able to find a lead on who committed this crime." In the back of his mind, though, he knew it must have been one of the Mafias. After all, who else could it have been? While they were discussing the topic of investigation, two individuals approached them on the matter. One was an unfortunate young man who seemed convinced that his entire life was a video game, and believed that the investigation could be postponed until tomorrow. This, however, was certainly not the case. Especially with the killer still on the loose, there was no telling how long the trail would last, or when they would strike again. Neither Professor Barsdley nor the young blue-haired woman had the chance to explain this to the poor man before he walked away, though. Professor Barsdley just shook his head, seeming almost amused at the ordeal. At around the same time, the eccentric and very colorful hairdresser, Leopold Endicott, arrived on the scene, cheerfully remarking that the two of them made an excellent team and offering to style them for the occasion. Professor Barsdley gave a light-hearted chuckle at the suggestion. He was fine with his current appearance, though he couldn't deny the stylist's taste for the unique. "No, that's quite all right," he said, brushing some of his luscious locks of brown hair behind his ear and adjusting his glasses. In response to Liliana's suggestion to stop by the tea house, he gave a serene smile. "That sounds like a wonderful idea. A nice cup of tea sounds delightful right about now." Cassidy Jackson was surprised when she came back to Ipham Cove to hear that NTWF had been killed. She and her college buddies used to hang out at that cake shop all the time. Birthday parties, post-final celebrations, or just the random desire to eat cake, you could always count on the folks at Everington Cakes to make you something nice. That said, it seemed only appropriate to attend the funeral service. She didn't have any black dresses to wear, so instead she wore the nicest outfit she had, hoping it would be enough. She just wished she had thicker leggings. Knee-length skirt plus -2°F weather was not the best combination. "Oh, great, we have to go outside again," she thought to herself when the sister announced this. She hated to be bitter about something so comparatively inconsequential, but she felt like she had just barely gotten warm again. She let out a sigh, adjusting her wavy blonde ponytail before standing up to follow everyone else to the coat closet. At least her coat kept part of her warm. "I didn't know you'd be here, Miss Jackson," came a familiar voice, which came as a surprise to Cassidy. She turned to the speaker, who was none other than Professor Barsdley, her anthropology teacher. Unlike his usual teacherly attire, for the funeral he was wearing a nice black suit. "Oh, yeah, I heard about what happened," Cassidy replied. "I didn't know you knew Anna, Professor." "I didn't know her well, no, but her death caused quite a stir yesterday morning. Killed by the Mafia, they say," Professor Barsdley told her. He shook his head sadly, which, with the professor's usual relaxed demeanor, looked more like a gentle parent's disappointment with a naughty child. "Such a terrible tragedy indeed." Yeah. Cassidy fidgeted a little, uncomfortable at the thought. When she came here to Ipham Cove, to Pretty Boy College, she was looking for education and preferably some, well, pretty boys. She absolutely did not expect that there would be mafia in town, people getting murdered. Would it even be safe to stay here anymore? She really didn't want to die. She was too young to die. Much to her dismay, these thoughts were interrupted by the sound of screaming, coming from the coat closet. Oh dear, what was that about? Professor Barsdley wondered, following the sound of the screams. Cassidy, not sure what else to do, followed after him nervously. Those were not nice screams. Those sounded very much like murder screams. And sure enough, when they got there, there was a body. Though barely visible through the crowd of heads, they could tell that someone had been killed, and it was not a pretty sight. Just the brief glimpse that Cassidy caught of the scene was too much for her, and she immediately turned and ran for the nearest restroom, feeling completely sick to her stomach. This can't be real, she tried to tell herself. This has to be some kind of nightmare. Professor Barsdley frowned, watching her run off. The poor child was too young to see such trauma. The poor boy who was killed was far too young to die as well. As he listened to the reporter give her report on the situation, he was, again, not terribly surprised to hear that apparently it had been done by the abominable Ipham. After all, only the Mafia could have such blatant disregard for human life. To kill a child at a funeral. How utterly tragic indeed. At the assistant mayor's suggestion to vacate the room, Professor Barsdley was happy to oblige. Though his coat was still in the coat closet, he decided to head outside for now. If the sisters said they would be proceeding with the funeral anyway, it seemed the appropriate choice. It was very cold that day, with an even worse wind chill, but he didn't seem to mind. Perhaps living in Ipham Cove helped him adjust to the absolutely frigid winters, or perhaps there was just too much on his mind for him to care. There had been 2 kills now, the second one clearly claimed by the abominable Ipham, the Mafia. While the sudden increase in violence was not terribly surprising to him, he had to wonder if there was a message here to be heard. Violently killing a blind child at a funeral and leaving their calling card to boot? This was a warning. Anyone could be next. Some others came outside as well, presumably overcome with grief, save, perhaps, for the velociraptor. As the door opened and closed, occasionally he could still hear voices from inside the church. One voice that stood out among the others was a child's. Oddly enough, it sounded like the victim's voice, wailing in pain. Professor Barsdley, however, dismissed the idea. Surely he was imagining things. Ghosts weren't real, after all. Professor Barsdley had been pondering to himself all the implications of what had happened when suddenly a crowd broke out of the church, dragging the assistant mayor along with them. He was startled at first, but after getting a good look at the crowd, at the makeshift gag that Mr. Smith was wearing, he realized what was happening. With the police gone, and no one to handle a proper investigation or trial, the townspeople took it upon themselves to do their own executing. This was somewhat alarming, and yet, somehow, he wasn't terribly surprised. After all, there was mafia in town. Everyone was getting restless. Bloodshed at this point was inevitable. Still, to think it had come to this. Angry townspeople throwing an innocent man off of a cliff, thinking he was a member of the mafia. All he could do was watch the phenomenon, staring wordlessly as the assistant mayor's body tumbled off the edge. A sharp crack echoed through the air as he landed, punctuating the reality of the situation. The man was dead. And yet, somehow, his crazed voice seemed to echo through the air immediately afterward. This was the second time Professor Barsdley thought he had heard the voice of a dead man, and it was honestly quite puzzling. Perhaps the whole ordeal was getting to him. After all, he was positively certain that ghosts weren't real. He just shook his head, wandering back toward the church in thought. 3 people were dead now, in such a short period of time. How many more were doomed to the same fate? Well, there goes breakfast, Cassidy thought bitterly as her nausea finally started to subside. All it took was one brief glimpse at that poor kid's body, the overwhelming scent of blood. She felt dizzy just thinking about it. She was really not prepared for this kind of violence. Unfortunately, if there really was mafia in town, somehow she got the feeling that it wasn't going to end here. She moved to the sink, starting to wash up after her little vomiting spell, and thinking on what she would do next. Obviously, she would have to go back out, but then what? She absolutely dreaded the thought of having to go back to that coat closet where that kid's body was. I mean, presumably someone would have taken it to the morgue or something by now, but even the mere thought of the body being there was enough to make her sick. But that closet was right by the door, and she couldn't stay in this church forever. Mustering up her courage, Cassidy made her way back toward the door, trying to push all her apprehension aside. "Don't panic," she tried to tell herself. "You're not going to die. No one else is going to die. Everything will be fine." which made it all the more devastating when she returned, just in time to hear the reporter say that someone else was dead. Her instinct was to bolt, maybe to vomit again, or perhaps just to go hide somewhere and cry. But she steeled herself. She couldn't just run away from this. Where would she run to? There was no telling where was even safe anymore. After all, that kid was killed at a funeral, and now... What? She stammered, trying to work through all her emotions. What is wrong with this town? Professor Barsdley was about to go back into the church, hopefully to convince whoever was watching over the body to allow him to fetch his coat, when Mr. Endicott stopped beside him on a motorcycle. He alluded to the investigation notes Mr. Smith had been making, insinuating that perhaps there was something useful contained within. He also suggested going to the town hall and asking what they should do in this situation. That may be for the best, actually, Professor Barsdley agreed. If nothing else, the mayor would surely be interested to know what had happened to his assistant. He decided that he may as well accompany Mr. Endicott to the town hall, thinking on what he might say to the mayor. He also pondered over what Mr. Smith might have learned about these murders. Perhaps he had learned something to help them determine who was behind all of this.